I welcome everybody and thanks to La Pietra Dialogue and NYU Florence for organizing this. This is one in a series of events on 1968 that we've been organizing this semester. It's the fourth. We had already Catherine Stimson and Ida Dominiani coming here and talking about the feminist and gender dimension of 1968, and then we had one talk about 1968 in movies, and today we have another event on Italy in 1968, history, memory, and autobiography. And we have a very distinguished guest, to say the minimum that we can say, about the pleasure of having here Luisa Passerini from the University of Turin and from the European University Institute. I'm going to read the biography for that is known to everybody here, also my students. Welcome them to students. We talked about Luisa Passerini's work last week. Luisa Passerini research has followed several major themes which form connecting threads through various fields. She has studied the history of the subjects of social and cultural change from her African liberation movements to the movements of workers, students, and women in our century. In her research, she has largely used memory in its oral form as expressed through interviews and testimonies, from constructing a history of fascism under a new perspective, as well as a history of gender and generation identities. Memory, understood in large sense as an epoch's heritage of the past in its various forms, has been the object of her writings on the methodology of history and on the relationship between history and the social science. In the field of methodology, she has devoted particular attention to the links between sources, objects, and methods, and to the interpretation of sources for a history of subjectivity. So the format of today is basically that of an open conversation. I'm going to basically pose a series of questions. I'll pose 2 or 3, and then we'll open the floor for an open discussion. I don't need to introduce 1968 here. We've been talking along the semester about it, and we made both an attention to the European dimension, and particularly the Italian one, where 1968 we know started even before 1968 and lasted very long. It's clearly the longest 1968 in Europe. We also talk about the connection with the American experience in those same years, but particularly dear to our perspective here this semester is the connection between 1968 and 2018, Year of Revolt, the title of our series, which tries to sort of investigate also a little bit the parallels between 1968 and the current generation that is here well represented by the students. So you're not certainly here to listen to me, so let's turn the attention and the reflection to Luisa Passerini. So my first question is whether you, well, let's start with this generational parallel. I mean, in a sense, one of the key points, or the one that one always remember about your famous book on 1968 is this phrase on choosing to be orphans, which mark a generational shift. And 1968 as a generation that, let's say, perform a rupture by separating themselves consciously from their parents. How much of that you think is still valid as a way to look at that generation, and also in relation to today's generation? Well, the millennials somehow as we call them, and there was an article yesterday in the Financial Times saying they are not there anymore anyway, or they've never been there. The millennials, rather than setting themselves, separating from the parents, clearly they use that as a kind of resource. Family has changed completely. But also they are not setting themselves against, but rather apart, if anything. So I'll put it like that and see also in case anyone wants to respond. Please.
Well, thank you very much, Davide, for inviting me and for this introduction, which is generous and very complicated, actually, because you have posed a cluster of questions. First of all, generation. Yes, it is true that the generation of 1968 talks of itself saying we. And very often, we and I are interchangeable. This is true for the student movement. This is true for feminism also. Because one of the characteristics of these movements both was the correspondence tension between the individual and the collective. This is crucial. And by the collective, I mean both the actual collective, like the assembly, the group, the consciousness raising group, the small group, and the larger collective, like gender, or women, or the oppressed. So this question, individual, collective, is crucial to understand the subjectivity of the movements, plural, of 68, the long 60s. This might be one difference with the millennial. I'm not sure, I'm asking you all, but the fact that I become capable of talking of myself and putting myself as a subject in history thanks to the fact of being an intersubjective link with others. And we identify ourselves as a group, as a collective, maybe very large. Now this, however, is not to be taken in the sense of strict realism, because it is not the whole generation of 68 that did 68. In fact, for that book and for the other book by Fraser that we wrote together, that he actually did materially write, but that which we contributed to as researchers collecting materials, oral material. This was also, I mean, our research with the protagonists was also coupled with research, oral research, oral history research, with people who had not participated in the movements. People who had been, in fact, apart, who had assisted, they had seen what was going on, felt it perhaps, but had not been strictly speaking part of it. So when we talk of generation, let us remember that we have two concepts in mind. One is the actual generation, biologically speaking.
Okay.
And the other is the political generation. And this concept of political generation meaning a group of people more or less the same age, not exactly the same age, because, I mean, in Italy, protagonists of 68, I mean, both leadership and all sorts of militants, were born more or less between 1937 and 1955. So it's a rather large range. But this generation is a political generation in the sense that it is united by having gone through similar political experiences. This is the concept of political generation. So this question of orphan, being an orphan, actually it comes from a graffiti which was found in Pisa. Pisa was one of the universities where 68 was most lively. And the writing said, voglio essere orfano, I want to be an orphan. It meant, in fact, this cutting the relationship with the past, also with the personal past. Many of the, especially the women interviewed for this research, said to me, what I really didn't want to was to resemble my mother. Anything but not resemble my mother. What did they mean? Sometimes they had rather good relationship with their mothers, but they meant practically all or most of their mothers had been housewives and mothers, in fact, literally. So they wanted to be different. And so the detachment was first of all from the mother.
More than,
Yeah, I'm talking now for the women. The women in the feminist movement in Italy, especially the radical feminist movement, were the daughters of the father very often. No children until at a late age, and the daughters of the father in the sense of not wanting to resemble a feminine image, inventing a new one. As far as the fathers, yes, of course, detachment from the fathers, there are many examples there, like the fathers, for instance, even the fathers who had been on the left, anti-fascists, resistance, partisans in the anti-fascist resistance, but they were the past, in fact. And, for instance, the resistance had been reduced to celebration on the 25th of April. And so there was an opposition to anything that the fathers had been. This idea of being the first, I mean, we are now starting a new, I'm repeating words that were often said, we are now starting a new epoch. And there was nothing before us, there was nothing. For the feminists, for us feminists, it was, I mean, the great movements for suffrage or the great movements for women's liberation in the 19th century and late, we couldn't care less. And we said we are very different from them because they were fighting for parity, equality, and we are fighting for difference. We want our difference affirmed. So this was denial of history, complete. I don't know, your question, whether this is also a way of setting oneself apart. Certainly it is setting oneself at the beginning of something else and sort of opening a new ground, completely new ground. And this was true both for personal, individual, and the general, the collective. And in fact, the words of order like political is the personal is political, this is really feminist, but a feminist word of order. But the relationship, close relationship and osmosis between public and private, this was 68. When I say 68, I really mean, in fact, a longer period. Of course, everything started in a way in Berkeley, 1964. But in Europe, already 65, 66, there were a number of revolts. The most significant in terms of symbolic significance was Strasbourg. Have you talked at all about Strasbourg? University of Strasbourg was one of the most important in France, and there was, as in many other universities in Italy, there a sort of small trade union, students' trade unions. Not really small in terms, I mean, possibly many were virtual members, but nobody was really doing anything, except a very few ones. Very, very few students were active. And they received, it was an institutional sort of trade union. They received money from the university to keep this student union going. Now, the Situationists, with whom I was at the time in close contact and sympathy, one of them, Mustafa Kayati, was there and had a group of sympathizers with Situationism. Of course, Situationism had very radical ideas. The International Situationist, the Situationist International, believed that a radical revolution of daily life had to. Anyway, what did Mustafa Kayati and his group of students do? They took hold. They sort of did a little coup d'etat in this student union. So they got all the money that was in the. Nobody cared for vote. They were elected, but it was very easy to be elected. So they did. What did they do with this money? They published a the Bible of '68, de la misère au milieu qu'il y a, of poverty. How did you translate it in English? Of poverty in the student environment. And this was a violent sort of pamphlet against the system, against the ignorance of the so-called academy and so on, which created a big scandal, first of all, because it had been printed many thousands with public money, but also it was distributed free. It was a terrible scandal. So I was one of the 3 or 4 people who left from Italy and went to look for them. In Strasbourg, we didn't know where to go because finally we found, quite by chance, Mustafa Kayati and others, who is Egyptian, who is in Egypt now, but I think he's originally Tunisian. We went to a birreria and very close to the university, and there we found them. So it's all sort of like a fable. Anyway, we did, our small group of fellow situationists translated this brochure, we called it, this little book, into Italian, and it was sold without any copyright, because we didn't believe in copyright. It was a form of property. Of course, Feltrinelli, that published the pamphlet, was very happy that we didn't want any copyright. So some of the contradictions of that time. But anyway, this big scandal revealed the situation of the university, the internal contradictions of the university. And so 66 started a whole series of actions of this sort. Forms of revolt of the daily situation in the university. Well, I would go into a totally different trend of thought now. So if we want to stay here, and then I'll pick up the other one.
So I want to remain close to the book, because if there was a book which was at the same time groundbreaking, but also functioned as a point of reference then for more than a generation of researchers in finding an inspiration for a new way to do research with memory, was Autobiography of a Generation. In my personal but very authoritative opinion, more than the research on fascism. I mean, these has marked more the memory of a generation of researchers. The mixing of the personal and the collective, the research into the specularity between history and psychoanalytic research was, I mean, very, very sophisticated, and has remained kind of a point of reference, or this book, Autobiography of a Generation, as it is translated into English, or Autoritratto di Gruppo, in the original Italian. In a way, I mean, already in Freud, there was a certain, I don't know what was the relationship, and this is part of the question, in what area of psychoanalysis you kind of digged. But in Freud already there was a kind of likening between the job of the psychoanalyst and the job of the archaeologist, sort of going to pick and reconstruct. So that's part of my question. My final point on the book, it would be, but this is a completely different question. So the book was written, Autobiography of a Generation, for the 20th anniversary of 1968. And somehow it's remarkable how it has remained a point of reference would you, I don't know, would you add something now, 30 years down the road? But
would you
add something, or I don't know, is there anything you would add about that kind of research? But anyway, this is the less important. I can go back to the sort of change in the generation, how the generation remembers itself. Anyway, so the question was more about the specular dimension between history and psychoanalysis.
Let me make a premise. You said that this book was more, somehow had more impact than Fascism in Popular Memory. May I say that actually Fascism in Popular Memory was a book written within the academia, but critical of the traditional epistemological, historiographical system. This was written outside, and in fact it came, I mean, John Scott's introduction came to me as a surprise, because I hadn't thought it had been written outside the academia from my point of view. And in Italy it was taken as not at all as a book, a history book. It was supposed to be, it was explicitly called, an egg out of the basket, something that didn't have anything to do with the historical profession. So in the long run, yes, it might have had, but because this had to do, however, with a very important aspect, which is the format of expression. The format of, it's not only a change of how you do history, how do you write history? How do you let your own voice? You know, Michel Perrault, the great French historian, in her Ego Histoire, she wrote one of the Ego Histoires that composed the book edited by Pierre Nora. Ego Histoire is something that is produced when you ask, Pierre Nora is the same who had this idea of the lieu de mémoire. But he also had the idea of Ego Histoire, less famous, but very interesting. You ask a historian to tell her his story, not in the form of a life autobiography, but from the point of view, why did you become a historian? From the point of view of meta-historical somehow, what led you to? Anyway, she wrote this wonderful piece in which she says that she had been trained as a historian to write the word je, I, only in the introduction, but never in the text, in the book. So you see, this is a big change. When does the...
Yes.
And so the format of expressing history is very relevant. Now, this is also perhaps a beginning of a reply to your question, because both psychoanalysis and history and archaeology are have to do with the past, but not in the sense of reconstructing the past. Not at all. In analysis, you're not supposed to reconstruct your past. You're supposed to relive some experiences and so on. I will not summarize here what you're supposed to do in analysis. In archaeology, yes, you do excavate, but then you also invent an interpretation, more or less. And in history, you certainly, I mean, the new way of doing history is based on the idea that we are not trying to discover the past as it really was, as von Ranke, the positivist historian, said. No, we are finding new connections between the past and the present. So there is a definite connection between history and psychoanalysis, but in this sense of creating the new relationship. Was there anything else here? Was there not? What would I add today? You mean in comparison with when the book was written, 1988.
Mm-hmm.
It's now very, very far. We are on the other side. There is...
Let me put it in another way. Let's say that one of the identifiers that are common in some of the people you interviewed as a way to identify their generations, some of the things you mentioned already, the setting themselves against the system or rupturing with their previous generation. But another one is we've been defeated. We've been defeated, and somehow that's a way in which that generation identify itself, maybe at that time, 20 years after. Now, maybe that side of the memory of that generation has kind of probably changed. I don't know what is your opinion on that. I'm thinking also that in relation to, we discussed already in the other talks on 68 how one of the difference with today is the role of victimization today as a marker of the present way of revolting, and how it was not the case maybe at the time.
At the time being the...
At the time at 68. There are 3 days.
1988.
Yes, there are these various moments, yes. 1968, 1988, 2018.
It was always clear that we had lost from the from the second half of the 70s. Of course, different dates were given for the defeat, depending on the country. Mind you, 68 is a world movement. It's a global series of movements. So it's all over: Mexico, Japan, some countries in Europe, North America. So, of course, with some change of dates. But I'm talking about a global movement. And for Italy, it was clear that we had lost probably a number of events, like the defeat of the working class struggle in 74, lasting after years, especially in Torino, where after that the Fiat was dismembered and almost doesn't exist any longer, working class. But of course, the thing is very complicated because, for instance, feminism was not defeated. Feminism is one of these movements. Of course, it's very debatable which is the relationship between 68 as a student movement and the feminist movement. But anyway, it's the only movement that has kept going.
Yeah.
So the sense of defeat, however, I think has changed very much through time. There is one of the interviewee, Romano Madera, who says, quoting the Latin phrase, I was in a shipwreck, but I navigated very well. What is it? Is it in English? How did Lisa Herbert translate it? Anyway, you understand what I mean. The trip was very good, but in the end, I lost. And that was clear, but today, the defeat seems to be total. Why? I mean, it seems to be more total than it ever did. First of all, there is a book which is very important by Boltanski and Chapelot, originally published in French, Le Nouvel Esprit du Capitalisme, translated into Italian and into English, and The New Spirit of Capitalism. Now they say, in very articulated analysis, it's a huge book, or several years now, that the consequences of 68 have been perverse. Perverse in the sense that the words of order of 68 were taken by capitalism, the late capitalism, whatever you call it, and transformed into their opposite. So one of the words of order was freedom of work. And it has become the flexibility of work, which means you can fire anybody at any time, and the uncertainty of work. So the opposite. Mm-hmm. Another similar perversion is concerning sex, gender. The Declaration, which was a banner, 68, sexual freedom, sexual liberation, has been transformed in the possibility of sex to be sold in political terms. Not necessarily money, but in an exchange on a political ground. So this is, in a global sense, perverse effects of 68. And in a more also still in a global sense, there are movements here and there, all over the world, which are right-wing populists. This is the opposite. But it's interesting that sometimes similar words appear. The revolution. Right-wing populism uses the term of revolutionary and so on. So I see a great distance, and perhaps the fact that it is so distant means that there must be other ways, because the old ones have been used by power. Mm-hmm. But for instance, think of Hong Kong, Occupy, or even Wall Street, but more Hong Kong. And that has the sense of something really new, I think, something different. Mm-hmm. Would you say that's in the spirit of 68? Oh, yeah.
I think that's a good way, a perfect way to open the floor.
This thing I'm drinking is just a throat balm. I don't want you to believe that I'm drinking something.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm Adrian Matus. I'm from the European University, and with Vladimir we work on 68, but on the other part of Europe, so-called across the Iron Curtain. And our question is, what, in your opinion, for the main networks of people, how did it change the totalitarian system in what concerns 68? How was it different in communist countries, in the Eastern Bloc?
You should say that. I mean, you are the experts on this history.
No, I'm curious, how do you perceive it? How do you perceive it? How did you perceive it as a witness in that period?
I see.
How was it for the Czechs? Was it the same thing, a Maoist, a Czech, Soviet? How did you perceive? What was à la mode, the main discourse à la mode at that period in Italy?
In Italy.
Coming from France, from international Situationists, so what was perceived?
What was?
Perceived, how was it?
Well, first of all, the movements of 1968 did not have an idea of Europe. We were not, there was actually an anti-Europeanism, because Europeanness and Europe and Europeanism were supposed to be bourgeois, sort of. So the concept of Central Eastern Europe was not significant. So this is a premise, sort of. And what was significant was, of course, the idea of the communist bloc. And particularly, there is not one position, okay? It's very differentiated because, for instance, Italy has had a strong tradition of communist, local communist, national communism. It doesn't no longer. But that meant a certain independence from the communist regimes. Actually, one of the most important communist party in the West, which had this autonomous position. but always keeping a certain caution. So, the Communist Party would not criticize too strongly the Moscow regime, was always there. But if we talk about the Situationists, there was a total critique, extreme in a way, because the critique involved the whole history. So Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, every one. And the only thing that was saved were the Soviets, the councils. Now, in the movements themselves, I mean, among the militants, I think there was a very confused idea of all this. There was a sense of sympathy for anybody fighting against the regime, yes. But it was completely unclear how the whole thing was. Certainly, I mean, Prague, yeah. Great participation and so on. But to understand, it was flattened. We all fight against power, but it's very different to fight against. So I think that's one of the weak points, except among certain leaders, but the general perception. It would be worthwhile to go through to do a research on that, because what I'm saying is what I got out of this, but the research did not focus on this specific point.
Was a global, can we say it was a global or transnational phenomenon? Because there are some common points between Havel and perhaps Patočka and what's happening in maybe the generation before Patočka and Havel, for instance, and Combandi. But is it the same? Is it the same movement, or is just?
Very good question. This is actually one of the questions that has not been explored enough, because I think what has not been clearly studied is in which way was it global and in which ways it was not. I'm certain that it was global because if you compare Zengakuren and Zekyoto in Japan and the French May and Mexico, you see great. But at the same time, there were huge differences. And also, how come it was so global? Because one of the questions is, what were the communication? Which were the ways of communication? Well, yes, we knew about Berkeley because of the famous book by Draper. But in many cases, was it like for feminism, people going back and forth across the Atlantic would bring pamphlets, leaflets, ideas. Very often they were men, but it was the feminist movement which was separatist. So how did they communicate? We know very little about this. How did the same ideas come up? Certainly, there are many hypotheses that have been made, like think of the role of music. I mean, the sense of belonging to a generation that had started in 1950s with music, and music was extremely important in Eastern Europe as a sign and a symbol, but as an actual revolt. The new type of music, I mean, So these roots have been explored only partially. And the question is double. Were there actual concrete ways of communicating, or was there also a similar situation in the various countries that led to similar responses? I say similar, they were not identical. I think this is an area where the research is weakest. The international, transnational. Why don't you tell us, I mean, after you should tell us a few words about your own research. The two of you should tell us just more precisely what you're doing.
For my case, I work on 68 in Romania and Hungary, and I try to draw a comparison to see whether there were some transnational, or to what extent 68 was accessible. And in Romania, it's far different than in Hungary, because in Hungary, contrary to what one may expect, there appears the criticism is done from the system. So there appears some Hungarian Maoists. And in Romania, that's not the case. The critique is done from a right perspective. So that's my approach, and I want to understand, because one says that throughout Iron Curtain, information could not pass, but that's not necessarily the case. But still, it was filtered, and
very interesting.
And Vladimir as well. He works on.
My name is Vladimir. I'm coming myself from Belarus. Do research on Belarus as well. And for the Soviet Union, it was very different. Like mostly 68 in the Soviet Union was a reaction to events in Czechoslovakia and the intervention of the USSR to Czechoslovakia. And it was the date, 68 was the birth of dissident movement, which had nothing in common with like student movements in the West. On the one hand, and so like in this sense we had, like in the Soviet Union there was no generation of 68, because people who were born between 37 and like 55, like my parents, they were not aspiring, like many of them were not aspiring towards, even they were not enthusiastic about music, at least a big part of them. Yeah. On the other hand, there were some things like many things were happening in '68 as well. Like so, apart from some reactions, some protests against invasion to Czechoslovakia, also some very local protests, like leaflets distributed in provincial towns, some graffiti written against tanks on the streets of Prague. There were also like subcultural things, like beat music festivals or theater, like staging of. Which was quite revolutionary at the time in the Soviet Union, staging of Waiting for Godot, like things like that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very, very, yes.
Angelica. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's lovely to finally meet you. I read so much of your work for my own work, so it's really a great pleasure to meet you. And my question was a bit beyond 68, but is more about oral history. And I was wondering how difficult has been for you as a female historian using oral history and changing a bit the way we tell history using stories. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about this shift, and if it's how difficult it's been to introduce this maybe in the Italian historiography landscape.
You mean difficult in the reactions I met? Well, yes. Well, my work was recognized first of all outside of this country. Yes. I don't think there is, of course there is no chair of oral history in Italy. There have been great researchers outside the academy usually. And one of the best known oral historians, Alessandro Portelli, is really a literary academician. So no, historians have been the most difficult ones. But, you know, that has been true also for the gender history to a large extent. There is now a chair, I think in Bologna, at least, and one perhaps in Rome. But it was always, it was always very difficult to have this sort of research recognized as historical. Could be anthropological, sociological, literary, but not historical. Have things changed now, I wonder? Yes, to some extent they have, in the sense that more historians use oral sources, but the difference is whether you use them to support other sources or to contrast, or whether you use them for a history of subjectivity. And I mean, everybody has been, of course, using oral testimony. If you're writing the autobiography of somebody and you interview him or her. So, yes, I think there are, I mean, Britain is a good place for oral history. The United States is very much. And, you know, one sign is where do you find good oral history archives? Because if you don't have that, I don't know to whom I should give my interviews on 68. They are in my country house presently. Of course, it's absurd, but I want to give them to some institution that will take care of them. All the material, the oral material I collected for Fascism in Popular History, I gave it to the University of Turin, thinking that it, you know, public institution. They put it in the basement where at some point there was
Damp.
Yeah, and so they are all lost. Oh. They are literally lost. I can talk about this now. You used to be so devastated that I could not. Yes, the archive is the proof that you care about this material. And you have to transfer, all this was recorded on cassettes. You have to transfer it digitally, otherwise it will be lost. It will be already lost.
Just as an immediate response, we were 4 researchers at the first year at the Institute, and we at the very beginning of the year we were asked by the Institute, and we asked the Institute, okay, we are going to record this. Where will it go? Where will it end? And now we faced that we have to create a library division for preservation of the archives. So I hope in 1 year it will be more clear how the institution deals with it, and probably at least recordings of BAPE project can be safely, copies of them can be safely stored there.
Yes, so both the archive and the library.
It would be rather, as far as I understood, it would be rather the library, special division of the library. Mm-hmm. So far, let's hope that it will work together, let's hope that we can cooperate in this regard.
Good news. So.
I would have a question, thinking also of the students here, and about the strength of identity politics today. I wanted to, and I noticed you have talked a lot about subjectivity, and I wanted to have your opinion on identity. Also, I found that in the introduction there is a definition of you as a historian that works on identity via memory, and I thought that must be not exactly welcome or your way of thinking about that. So I wanted to ask you about the way, your research was in subjectivity, and somehow how you place yourself in relation to the question of identity.
I rather dislike the expression identity because it presupposes something fixed. If we can think of a mobile identity changing all the time, that's what it is. Identity politics is something else. I'm talking about identity as a conceptual category. But if you want to claim that you are whatever you want to be, that's you're right. I personally have criticized, devoted much of my time to criticize the idea of European identity because I thought it was exclusive, hierarchical, and so on. And identity today is often the word of order of right-wing, European identity, Fortress Europe, and so on. But words have a story, have history, so as long as you use identity in a different sense and say it, and it's not something inherited, something that somebody else gives to you, it's fine. I mean, I don't want to prohibit words, but concepts, yes, I could, if I could.
So please join me in thanking very much Luisa Passerini for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, to us. Thank you.
Thank you.